I think the US and Russia would certainly want to avoid, say, an all-out war where nuclear submarines are engaged. Yeah, I mean, it would certainly depend on how if the submarines were out there and began to conduct some sort of operation. It would very much depend on what the US would be looking to do. I doubt that Trump would have the appetite to go and strike at like some sort of Russian position. I think a more interesting option, instead of using the submarines, would be to take, say, Ukrainian sea drones and hit a Russian ship in the Arctic to show, the US is like supplying intelligence, or NATO is now allowing Ukraine to use some of their space to conduct strikes far away from Ukraine and the European theater and hit Russia somewhere else around the world. I think that would be a much better, low cost and cost effective solution to strike at the Russians and send them a message. And I just don't think that the cost calculus is there for the US to want to go use a submarine to conduct the strike. I think rather it would be some sort of posturing where the US would send it, it can emerge, be visible so that the Russians know that it's nearby. And, if I can imagine that a scenario where they would want to use it is if a Russian fighter jet breaches NATO airspace and they shoot it down and the Russians begin threatening some sort of all-out war, then, I think that's where the submarines would come into play, where you can put them into a threatening position and let the Russians know that they should be very careful about what they say next, and what the U.S. would be able to do to the Russians to be able to bring down the heat a little bit. And so, of course, if there was a worst case scenario where the Russians were all out reckless and start bombing NATO and bombing European capitals, then the U.S. probably would go and help the Europeans fight back and shoot into Russia. And I imagine the Russians would quickly back down and start calling for peace. The US is certainly preparing for a potential war with China. I think right now the US is absorbing a lot of lessons both from the war or the conflict that Israel and Iran had, and what Israel is able to demonstrate in the Middle East. It's learning a great amount from Ukraine and what Ukraine is able to achieve with its unmanned systems and the wide-scale use of drones, and certainly the cost asymmetry that's being demonstrated on that battlefield. And of course, a war in the Asia Pacific would look very different from the other theaters. So the important thing is, how do you absorb the right lessons, but not over-index on some, and apply that to a war with China. And so one of the main ways is we're certainly clearing a lot of these World War II era airfields, trying to spread out the air bases and the military installations across the Asia Pacific, so that if China is to strike at one of these bases or airfields, the US would still be able to have plenty of other bases to conduct military operations from, continuing to try to match some of the output that the Chinese have in terms of manufacturing, how they're able to quickly produce warships, and just the wide scale capacity that the Chinese have, even from drones, right? I think a report from earlier this year showed that around 90% of components in American drones come from China. So becoming resilient with your supply chains in case a war with China does break out. And then figuring out how do we have air superiority against the Chinese, or be able to fight that duel. And companies like Anduril, it's a company from the private sector, they're trying to work on how do we mass produce cheaper ballistic missiles. So the idea would be, how do we overwhelm air defenses with some of these ballistic missiles and clear the way for other more powerful weapons to strike at targets. And of course, the military planners are thinking a lot about how do we fight back against the blockade of Taiwan. China certainly continues to plan and practice for a potential invasion and blockade of Taiwan. So I've chatted with US military planners that have thought about even some of the more basic items of, if a blockade happens of Taiwan, how do we keep communications up and running? And just conduct some of these like logistical missions into Taiwan if there's like an active blockade. And so the US, I think, just from its posture, is stepping back, gradually from Europe and other places, and focusing not even so much on China, but the recent memo from the U.S. or the Trump administration, the DoD, or now it's the Department of War, is to focus more on the Western Hemisphere and the Americas. So reinventing some form of the Monroe Doctrine. Um, and so I think the vanguard within the U.S. right now is torn between how much do we allocate to fixate on a war with China, and how much do we think about preparing for just focusing on our own hemisphere. But I think just like the war right now like between Russia and Ukraine, all these events are very interconnected. And right now, the Trump administration is conducting strikes on like cartel boats off of Venezuela. And so if a conflict did break out with Venezuela itself, Venezuela already has Iranian designed drones in its possession. I wouldn't be surprised if the Venezuelans are deploying more newer Russian and Chinese technology if a war did break out. And that goes to say that this modern axis of evil is far more interconnected. They're working very closely, supporting one another technologically and supporting engineering efforts, because these Iranian designed drones, Iran also helped build the factories for them in Russia, and then the Russians are able to mass produce them. And those same drones are now harassing European NATO airspace. Russia has sent, I think the past few months have shown to Trump just how interconnected these powers are with one another. It was recently in Beijing that Trump was posting on social media about that mini love affair that the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans were having in Beijing, and just how much support China has been giving along the North Koreans for Russia's war effort. I mean, Putin not have any intention of stopping the war anytime soon, and he's ignored all of Trump's demands. The rate of attacks on Ukrainian cities has only increased dramatically under Trump's presidency. So not only do you have a defiant Putin, but he outright lies to Trump, deceives him, and Trump and the Ukrainians have showed Trump that Russia is far weaker than many perceive them to be, and that Ukraine is very powerful. And I think that alliance is beginning to boom. There's talk about a very big arms package between the US and Ukraine, Ukraine supplying drones to the US. And so it's becoming more clear to Trump that the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, they're working very closely together, and that axis is very intent on trying to undermine the US and its allies. And I think Trump has made a very strong effort to try to secure peace, negotiate peace, but the Russians and their allies have no intention of backing down from their efforts to try to undermine the West wherever it can. The idea that the submarines are out there potentially lurking could play against Putin's paranoia, and make sure that the Kremlin understands that the US does have the ability to threaten and to put pressure on the Russians. And so it's certainly a guessing game for Putin to determine if they're out there or not. But it'd be good to see the US follow through on some of their actions and these threats to be carried out, whether it's sanctions are implemented, just so that the Russians really know that Trump means what he says and he's going to follow through on some of his actions. And I think that would give more weight to some of the statements when he makes around, such as like submarines being out there, because sometimes you just truly don't know if that's actually happening or not. But I think the risks for the U.S., I think we are already in World War III, because the war in Ukraine is so interconnected with everything else. You have North Korean soldiers fighting there. You have North Korea supplying around 40% of all of Russia's artillery needs. You have the Iranians that help build these drone factories in Russia, and Iranian engineers that were supporting their deployment. Iran has been sending missiles and other weapons to the Russians. The Chinese have been supplying around 80% of the critical electronics in the Russian drones, supplying them with the electronics that go into their missiles. So China is really behind so much of of the components that go into these weapons that are bombing both Ukraine and now Europe. And you have this axis of evil just working hand in hand now with the Russians in Ukraine. And again, you have even Chinese soldiers have been caught by the Ukrainians. And Reuters reported that Chinese officers have been near the front line observing and learning from the war. So it's very clear that they're working closely with one another, learning and going through this adaptation cycle where the Russians share lessons, they learn, and they're gearing up to use those lessons against the US and the West in future conflicts. And so, again, just the mere fact that you have North Korean soldiers fighting against the Ukrainians in Europe is a statement or a fact that this war, the world is already in a world war, just not at the scale that we would imagine. But again, this is the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and you have North Koreans, and somehow we've gotten used to just saying that, and that's like an acceptable piece of news that we're okay with the North Koreans learning about modern warfare and then what they're going to be able to do if a war breaks out in the Asia Pacific or against South Korea. And so if we're already not in a world war, then Russia's war in Ukraine is already setting us up for what's coming. And again, the Iranians are sending Iranian designed drones to Venezuela. And all these powers are supporting and growing technologically with one another. And so, and any future conflict that comes that brings in more powers, you're going to have this axis of evil on one side supplying their technology and weapons against the US and its partners.